So I've been getting asked a lot lately about program development and how to structure your training in an optimal fashion. Um, it's easier to talk about than write about, so I'm going to put up a few stories about that. Okay, so the first thing to understand is that grappling is a very unique activity in the sense that we're not dealing with something that's just there's no linear progression from good to bad in grappling, or rather from bad to good. So let's say we're talking about boxing, for instance. Well, boxing is an established sport with basically one set of rules. So to become a good boxer, you more or less know which parameters you're going to be operating within. Whereas by contrast, to say you're really good at grappling, it's more like saying you're really good at striking, right? Striking is similar in the sense that it's more vague about specifically what we're making reference to. So for instance, if someone tells me they want to get really good at striking, the next question that you're reasonably going to ask them is, well, what kind of striking? Are you talking about, boxing? Are you talking about kickboxing? Do you mean Muay Thai rules? Do you mean, I don't know, do you mean just striking in general, right? You just want to be decently good at everything, right? Whatever answer they give to that question is going to pretty radically transform the answer you're going to give about how they should go about structuring a training program. And it's very similar for grappling or jiu-jitsu. Both grappling and jiu-jitsu basically refer to 15 different rule sets, okay? And which ones matter the most depend entirely upon your perspective. So for instance, if you tell me that you want to win ADCC rules tournaments or EBI rules tournaments or IBJJF rules tournaments, right? You got to be good at jiu-jitsu as a baseline. There are common factors. But, at a higher level, when we're talking about winning at the elite stage, it's going to come down to very small things in specific skill areas, which are going to be different based upon the rule set. So, what a lot of people will say is, I just want to win everything. Okay. Okay, fair enough. I'm not saying you can't do that, but then I think a better way to do it is to take one at a time, right? Focus on one at a time and develop skills accordingly. Imagine if you have 10 years to develop, let's say 5 skills, right? If you try to develop all 5 skills concurrently, it's actually going to be harder than if you took each one and you prioritized them one at a time, right? Then you need to balance out what you're doing, right? Let's say that you're on to your second skill. You've spent a certain amount of time, you've gotten really good at the first skill, now you're on to the second skill. You still need to allocate a certain amount of time in order to not degrade the first skill, right? That's going to be important. So we've covered 2 topics so far. So far there's skill selection, right? What skills are you going to want to focus on? That's going to be based on what rule sets you want to win. And let's talk actually briefly a little bit more about that. Okay, so in order to determine what those skills are, probably your best bet is to watch a lot of matches in that rule set, preferably at a really high level, right? Because then what that's going to reveal to you is what are the most important skill sets for actually getting the job done. And this might take a long time, right? You might have to spend hours sitting there watching matches in your preferred rule set. But hopefully you enjoy that, right? If it's a rule set that you want to succeed in, hopefully you actually enjoy watching the matches. Otherwise, I don't even know why you're trying to do it. When you have the list of skills you need in order to succeed, the next thing is to set about creating an organized program, right? You say, okay, these are the 5 skills I need to work on. I'll put them in this order, and I'm going to set aside time in my training to work on them. And you got to have flexibility in this. You can't just you can't just say, okay, this is what I'm going to work on, and then let's say just is not fucking working for you after 6 months or something. You might have to adjust, right? You're going to have to, maybe you made some mistakes in your thought process. So you got to be willing to adapt, because if you are too rigid about your approach, that's not going to work well either. So now what you're doing over time is you have a specific goal. Okay, I want to win these types of tournaments. You've designated certain key skill sets, and then you have an organized structure in which you're going through those skill sets to learn them. As you're doing this, you're also always going to be going back and refreshing the old skill sets. You've got to allocate time for that. And you're also always going to be spending a certain amount of time to look at it and say, well, is this really working? To sort of, basically what I mean is you're always having some time to reassess what's happening, right? Your initial assessment of the most valuable skill sets, maybe you come to the conclusion that you were off about something, right? And you've got to have some room for flexibility to reassess. I think of this as very similar to almost like playing the stock market, if you will, right? You put your eggs in this basket and you hope it's going to pay off, 2 years down the line, but ultimately it's a gamble, right? A chance you could get really, really good at a certain skill set that maybe you come to the conclusion later on down the road that that's just kind of a fucking waste of time. That's why ultimately I recommend looking at evidence in order to try to avoid this sort of a situation. So for instance, like if you try to reinvent the wheel, so to speak, like you're going to run into a lot more mistakes in terms of like what you bet on, rather than if you were to like watch a lot of high level matches and determine like what skill sets people are already using to succeed. So for instance, like if you want to, like EBI is a really easy rule set to like game plan for, right? Like if your main goal is to win EBI rules tournaments, OT is one of the most important things you're going to need to get really, really good at. And like just watching matches will show that to you. Now, is it possible that some like completely meta shattering new strategy comes out which completely renders OT skills irrelevant? I mean, I guess. I don't see how that can happen, but I always leave room for that sort of a thing. And then, yeah, if you spent a lot of time working on OT skills, like, oh, you kind of wasted your time. But there's a lower chance of that happening, right? Because you can look at the available evidence and it doesn't suggest that that's likely to happen. Now, a lot of you guys are probably wondering, what specific, training should I be doing? What is there like a set of deliberate training techniques I should be utilizing in order to develop these skills? Well, I'll tell you what I do. I want to be clear that like I don't think that there's a single given like this is the only thing you can do to develop skills, right? Like there's definitely more than one way to get this done. There's obviously ways that are worse or better. But ultimately, there's no single given best way to go about developing your skills, right? Anyway, I'll just give you like what I do. I'm a really, really big believer in positional rounds and in like rounds with very narrow goals, okay, where you're like really focused on doing certain things. Static drilling is definitely useful for certain things. Like if anything is really like mechanically complex in terms of like your movement, I would recommend a lot of static drilling. But for things that require like less complex movements, like for instance body lock passing, it doesn't require a ton of super complex movements. It's tricky to get down because there's a lot of things that can go wrong, but statically drilling that, because it doesn't have many complex movements, it's kind of a waste of time in my opinion. Now, of course, you should probably do a little bit of static drilling before you try it in live training, like a couple minutes worth of it, but beyond that, I do think that because that's not that mechanically complex, you're better off trying it out in live training. If it is something that's more mechanically complex, like K-guard, right? K-guard, I think I can still drill K-guard a lot, even against like a non-resisting opponent, and get a ton of value out of that because it's a bit trickier. Your mind's working in a little bit more intricate fashion. So positional rounds and like rounds with really like narrow goals, what that is going to force you to do is develop key skills rather than just sort of aimlessly going through the motions. What you need to do is you need to think of every training session as being a balance of risk and reward. The reward is ultimately going to be the development of your skills. The risk is injury, which is going to put you back, okay? Now, if you go into the training session and you just, go to war with your training partners and you're just trying to win every round, are you going to get better? Yeah, you will, but it's probably not going to be in like specific or targeted ways to get you closer to your goals. You're going to get better at the things you're already good at. And if you get good at anything else, it's going to be because you were forced to by maybe another really skilled training partner. Maybe somebody puts you in an armbar situation and you have to defend because you don't have a choice. Well, now you're working on that skill, but it wasn't by your own, your own choice. Rather, what I think you should be doing is going in there and focusing on just like, what do I need to get better at? And you may lose rounds. Like, you have to be okay with that, right? Like I got submitted by a training partner the other day and I was like, fuck, this sucks. But I was trying something new, right? Like that is bound to happen, right? You have to be okay with that. If you're not going to get better in these key ways. Now, there are some guys that literally just show up and go to war and they turn out to be like really fucking good competitors. Like, make no mistake, that absolutely can work, right? I'm just giving my approach, what I think is the optimal way that I've found works for me. And final piece of advice on this topic, at least for today, is don't leave any of this up to just your memory. Write everything down. Like, write down what you're going to be working on and when you're going to be working on it. Basically, like a part of what you're working on is going to be, in your mind, but like over a long period of time, if you're trying to get good at specific skills, leaving that up to your memory is very, very difficult to do. It's much smarter just to write it down.